Volume 2, Chapter 3 of The Old Manor House. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Old Manor House by Charlotte Turner Smith. Volume 2, Chapter 3. Every one of the party who met at dinner at Mrs. Somerive's were ready to worship the General except Orlando, who still felt himself dissatisfied, and much disposed to inquire by what conversation and accommodation had yet been so easily brought. This inquiry, however, he, at his father's request, forbade to make, and the General was perfectly satisfied with the gratitude expressed by the rest of the family, and in the distant but polite behaviour of Orlando saw what confirmed him in his original idea that it would be much better if he was out of the way. The charms of Isabella had now such an ascendancy in the General's opinion that he determined nothing should impede his designs, and he believed that the straitened circumstances of Somerive, of which he was no longer ignorant, would give him the means of obtaining his daughter. Somerive had indeed communicated to him, as a friend, the uneasy situation of his affairs. He deplored the conduct of his eldest son. At their next conference, therefore, alone Tracy contrived, without forcing the conversation, to bring it round to that point. And when Somerive spoke of the distress which arose from the misconduct of his son Philip, the General took occasion to say, "It is indeed, my friend, a circumstance extremely to be lamented, and, in my opinion, renders the situation of your youngest son much more critical. I hardly wish he was in some profession. Have you considered what I said to you about the army? I believe I could be of very material service to you in that line." "Dear General," exclaimed Mr. Somerive, "how much I feel myself indebted to you!" "Yes, I certainly have thought of it, and the result of my reflection is, that if his mother consented, if Mrs. Rayland did not object—" "My good friend," interrupted the General, "can a man of your understanding, when the well-doing of such a son is in question, think that these ifs should have any weight? Mrs. Somerive, all tender as she is, has too much sense to indulge her fondness at the expense of her son's establishment; and as to Mrs. Rayland, I have not indeed the honour to know her, but the only question seems to be, will she or will she not provide for Orlando? If she will, why will she not say so? If she will not, are you doing your son an irreparable injury in suffering him to waste, in fruitless expectation, the best of his days?" "It is very difficult," replied Mr. Somerive, after musing a moment, "very difficult to know how to act. Mrs. Rayland has a temper so peculiar, that if she is once offended, it is for ever. Perhaps, however, since I see she piques herself on the military honours of her family, perhaps she may not be displeased at Orlando's entering on the profession of arms." She seemed much more eager to promote than to check his ardour in the effect with Sir John Belgrave; and as the British nation is now engaged in a quarrel with people whom she considers as the descendants of the regicides, against whom her ancestors drew their swords, it is not, I think, very unlikely that she might approve of her favourite's making his first essay in arms against those whom she terms the rebels of America." "As to that," answered the General coldly, "it may be very well in starting the idea to give her that notion, but in fact this campaign will end the unworthy contest. Of this I have the most positive assurances from my military friends on the spot, as well as the firmest reliance on the measures adopted by ministers, and I am convinced that those wretched ragged fellows, without discipline, money, clothes, or arms, will be unable longer to struggle for their chimerical liberty. Probably they are by this time crushed, and therefore, as no more troops will be sent out, your son will not, if you adopt this plan, be separated from his family, and may still occasionally visit this capricious old gentlewoman, who, unless she differs much from the rest of her sex of all ages and descriptions, will not like a handsome young fellow the less for having a cockade in his hat." "Ah, General," returned Somerive, smiling, "I fancy your own experience among the women well justifies the remark. Since you really are so sure that Orlando would not be sent abroad, which will make a great difference certainly in his mother's feelings on this point, and perhaps in those of Mrs Rayland, I will take an immediate opportunity of speaking it to my wife, and we will consider of the safest method of taking Mrs Rayland's opinion of it. As to Orlando himself, if there can be little doubt of his concurrence, at least I hope not, and there are other reasons, my friend, beside those that I have named to you, why his present situation is utterly improper, and why it seems to me that he cannot too soon be removed from it." Mr Somerive, in speaking thus, was thinking of Monimia, who, ever since he had first heard her described, had occurred to him continually. The necessities there was for attending immediate to the affair of the threatened duel had hitherto prevented his speaking of her to Orlando, in that serious manner which he thought the affair merited; but he had repeatedly touched on it, and finding Orlando shrinking from the investigation, he laid in wait for an occasion to probe him more deeply, an occasion which, perceived his father sought it, Orlando as solicitously endeavoured to avoid giving him, by contriving to be always busied in attending on his sisters or his mother. But while he thus got out of the way of his father, he was very much in that of the General, who could hardly ever get an opportunity of whispering to Isabella those sentiments which daily acquired new force. For, the week following that when the affair with Sir John Belgrave was settled, Orlando could find no excuse for returning to Rayland Hall of a night. He was therefore reduced to the necessity of going thither after his own family were in bed; and as the way through the chapel was not open to him, he could only see Monimia in her own room, and their meetings were therefore very short, and so hazardous, that the impatience and discontent of Orlando could no longer be repressed or concealed. The greater his attachment to Monimia became, and every hour it seemed to gather strength, the more terrible appeared her situation and his own. They were both so young that he thought he might easily obtain an establishment, and that the noon of their lives might pass in felicity together, where he, instead of remaining in a state of uncertain dependence, to be allowed to go forth into the world, sanguine and romantic in the extreme, and feeling within himself talents which he was denied the power of exercising, his mind impatient on visionary prospects, which he believed might easily be realized, when to provide for passing his life with Monimia was in question, everything seemed possible; and as he heard much of the rapid fortunes made in India, and had never considered, or perhaps heard of the means by which they were acquired, he fancied that an appointment there would put him in the high road to happiness; and various were the projects of this, and of many other kinds, on which his thoughts continually dwelt. General Tracy, who had long read mankind, easily penetrated into the mind of a man so new to the world as Orlando; and though he saw that his young friend did not greatly esteem him, he was not by that observation deterred from conciliating as much as possible his good opinion. till at length Orlando communicated his discontent at being at his time of life so inactive and useless; and the General, having brought him to that confession, started the scheme he had before proposed only to his father, of procuring him a commission, and lending him all the interest which he was known to possess, to promote his fortune in the army. A proposal so friendly, and so much adapted to the warm and ardent temper of Orlando, was acknowledged with gratitude, and without farther consideration embraced, on addition that his family did not oppose it. The General told him that it was in consequence of his father's apparent inclinations that he had at first thought of it; that his mother had certainly too much sense to reject such an advantageous offer for him, especially, added he, as from the present state of the war there is not the least likelihood of your being sent abroad. You know best, however, my dear sir,' continued the General, with something on his countenance between a smile and a sneer, 'you know best how far your campaigns against the game on the Rayland manors may answer better than the services of a soldier, whether the old lady's hand can bestow a more fruitful prize than the barren laurels you may gather in bearing arms for your country.' There was in this speech something that conveyed to Orlando an idea that he was despised, and that there was meanness in his attending on Mrs Rayland like a legacy hunter. Of all characters the most despicable, the blood that rushed into his cheeks spoke the painful sensations this impression brought with it. He could not, however, express them with propriety to a man whose only purpose seemed to be that of befriending him, by rousing him from indolence, and even from a species of servitude. The General saw that what he said had the effect he wished, and Orlando left him, determining to avail himself of the opportunity that now offered for obtaining what he believed would be a degree of independence. He began to consider how he might prevail on Mrs Rayland to assist, indeed of opposing this scheme, and how he might thus obtain a certain portion of liberty, without offending one to whom gratitude and interest contributed to attach him. A deep and painful sigh, raised by the reflection of the misery of parting from Monimia, followed the resolution he adopted; but he recollected that by no other means he could remove the cruel obstacles between them, and that resolution became confirmed. He had not, however, the courage to communicate to her the probability there was that they must soon part. Their short conferences, in every one of which they incurred the hazard of discovery, passed on her side in mournful presentiments of future sorrow, which she yet endeavoured to conceal, and on his, in trying now to console her, and now in acknowledging that there was but too much cause for her fears. Projects were considered, however, for their future meetings with less risk. She told him that during the time he was so much at home her aunt confined her less strictly throughout the day; that in proportion as she found herself become more necessary to Mrs Rayland, and more secure of a great provision after her death, Mrs Lennard became more indolent, and more addicted to her own gratifications. Betty, who was a very great favourite, had little else to do than to wait upon her, an employment in which Monimia herself was often engaged, although she was now more usually employed about the person of Mrs Rayland, who found her so tender and attentive that she began to look upon her with some degree of complacency. This task, while it added a heavy link to her fetters, she yet went through, not only with patience but with pleasure, for she hoped that by making herself useful to Mrs Rayland, she might not only have more frequent opportunities of seeing Orlando during the winter, which she imagined he would pass at the Hall, but perhaps obtain from her such a share of recollection at her death as might remove the necessity of an entire dependence on Mrs Lennard, a dependence which some late observations had made her believe as precarious as she felt it to be painful. In consequence of General Tracy's visit to Sir John Belgrave at the house of Mr Stockton, he received from the master of it an invitation, which he accepted. Mr Stockton first waiting upon him at West Wolverton, Sir John and Philip Somerive, and several others of the late visitants at the castle were gone into Scotland on a shooting party. But Mr Stockton had a succession of visitors. His magnificent style of living, which it was known he had a fortune to support, attracted not only all his London friends by turns to his house, but from every part of the country acquaintances poured in upon him, acquaintances who desired nothing better in the way of entertainment than his French cook and his well-furnished cellars afforded them. The clergy were his very constant guests, and he loved to have 2 or 3 of them always about him, at whom he might launch those shafts of which he had picked up here and there, and which consisted of commonplace jokes upon religion, well knowing that with these select few, orthodox as they were, the excellence of the entertainment he gave them secured their silence and complacencies. The General, who was in manners really a man of fashion, was by no means delighted with the gross and noisy society he found at Stockton's, but he saw that if he would escape suspicion he must not make his visit at Somerive's too long, and therefore was glad to be assured that there was an house in the immediate neighbourhood where he might remain a fortnight or 3 weeks. After prudence dictated his departure from that of Mr Somerive, which he now feared must happen before his hopes of Isabella were successful, for he found it much more difficult to obtain any degree of favour than his own vanity and her giddiness had at first led him to suppose. Isabella Somerive was not naturally a coquette, but she had a greater flow of spirits than any of her family, except her older brother, whom she greatly resembled in the thoughtless vivacity of his disposition. From her sex and education, what was in him attended with dangerous errors, was in her only wild but innocent gaiety, becoming enough to youth, health, and beauty. Of that beauty she had early learned the value. She had heard it praised at home, and found her father and mother were pleased to hear of it. But during her short stay in London she had been intoxicated with the incense that was offered her, and, notwithstanding the good humour inherent in her disposition, she failed not to enjoy, with some degree of feminine triumph, the preference that was given her over her cousins, whose admirers seemed all disposed to desert them on the first appearance of this rustic beauty; and she felt too the pleasure of retaliation for all the airs of consequences which the Miss Woodfords had assumed in their visits to West Wolverton, from their superior knowledge of fashions, public places, and great people. But, above all, Isabella was delighted by the preference given her by a judge so discerning as General Tracy, whose taste in beauty was so universally allowed, that his admiration had given eminence to several pretty women, who would never otherwise have been noticed. Far, however, from thinking of him as a lover, Isabella, who was, with all her vivacity, as innocent as little Emma herself, considered him merely as her father's friend, and would have applied to him for advice, in as much expectations of receiving it with disinterested wisdom as to her father himself. The fine speeches he took every opportunity of making, she believed partly arose from habit, and were partly proofs of his admiration, which she thought perfectly harmless. though it sometimes struck her as ridiculous; and in conversation with her sisters, and sometimes with her mother, she laughingly called the General her old beau, her venerable admirer, and said she wished he was 30 years younger. Mrs Somerive sometimes checked her, but oftener smiled at the description she gave of the General's solemn gallantry, and of the trouble she knew his toilet cost him, which really, she cried, grieves one's very heart. Poor man! It must be excessively fatiguing; and after all, I think he would be 1,000 times more agreeable if he could be persuaded to appear as my father and other men do of the same age, instead of putting on toupees and curls, which it requires so much art and time to make it sit snug and look natural. How preferable would a good comfortable wig be to his poor old head, which I am sure must ache sadly every day, before Beaumichel has patched up the gaps that time has made. And besides, I know he is always in fear of some of his borrowed chevaliers coming off and disgracing him. I have absolutely seen him nervous about it." "Dear Isabella," said Miss Somerive, who was present at this description, "how you run on! The General, I dare say, has no false hair; and if he has, how does it materially differ from a wig?" "Oh mamma," replied her daughter, "I believe it differs so much in the General's opinion, that he had rather have his head cut off than his hair. A wig! I have seen him shudder at the idea." "Have you seen him?" said Mrs Somerive. "Pray when?" "The other day, when he rode out with us. There was a terrible high wind, and I knew the ancient view would be 10 times more discomposed by it than we were; so, as soon as we got upon the downs, I set off with a brisk canter directly against it, and the poor dear General was obliged, you know, to follow us." "Well?" "Well, and so he buttoned up the cape of his great coat round his ears, and set off after us; but, as ill fortune would have it, this cape, I suppose, loosened the strings of his curls, and the wind blew so unmercifully that he did not hear of their defection from his ears. But as he came galloping up to me and Selina, who were a good way before him, these ill-behaved curls deserted, and were flying like 2 small birds tied by the leg half a yard behind him; and if he had been commander of a town suddenly blown up by the enemy, he could not have looked more amazed and dismayed than he did when I called out to him, 'General, General, your curls are flying away!' He put up his hand to his alternatively, and finding it too true that those cowardly curls had left their post, and were retained only by a bit of black twist, he gave them a twitch and thrust them into his pocket. Ever since that fever I got last year by overheating myself walking with the King at Windsor, I have lost my hair in some degree, and till it is restored I am under the necessity of wearing these awkward contrivances." "Dear General," said I, as I pitied his distress, "I am afraid you will catch cold without them. Had you not better wrap up a handkerchief about your head? I am sure you must feel a difference. I am in pain for you. It is indeed an awkward contrivance, and I should think you would find more comfortable and certain accommodation in a wig." "A wig!" exclaimed he, "a military man in a wig, like a turtle-eating cit, or a stock exchange broker? Impossible! No, lovely Isabella, you can never suppose I ought to make myself such a figure; and I assure you I have, when not hurt by illness, a very tolerable head of hair for your time of life, General," I said. This completed the poor good man's dismay, and he set about answering me that the military hardships he had gone through in the younger part of his life, and perhaps a little irregularity since, made him look at least 15 years older than he was, and so went on making such fine speeches as he thinks becoming in so young a man. "Upon my word, Isabella," remarked Mrs Somerive, "you will offend the General by all this flippancy, and your father, I assure you, will not be at all pleased if you should." "No, indeed, my dear mamma," answered she, "there is no danger of my offending him. The rattling speeches I make to him, and even my turning him to ridicule when my only Selina and I are by, is so far from offending him, that he seems to like it. Does not he, Selina?" "It is not right, however, in my opinion," said Selina. "Why not, if you please, my Lady Graveairs?" "Because I do not think a person's age," replied Selina, "a proper subject of ridicule." "No," answered Isabella, "not if they do not make it so, by attempting to appear young. But how is it possible to help laughing at a man who fancies that, at 60, he can pass for 26? "If it is the General's foible," said Mrs Somerive gravely, "it seems to be the only one, and it makes him happy, and hurts nobody. He is so a worthy man that it is immaterial whether he is 60 or 26; and if he has the weakness to prefer being thought the latter, which, however, Isabella, you know is not true, he should not be rudely reminded that nobody else thinks so." "Well, if this worthy man will flirt with and make love to girls young enough to be his granddaughters, I must laugh if it be wrong," cried Isabella. "Make love!" exclaimed Mrs Somerive. "What do you mean, child?" "Why, only, mamma, that if he were a young man, the marvellously fine speeches he studies will seem like love-making speeches. I told him the other day, that since he thought me so very charming a creature, I wished he would persuade his nephew to be of the same opinion, for there would be some sense in that." "His nephew? Who is his nephew?" enquired her mother. "I never saw him," replied Isabella, "but Eliza Woodford has often, and says he is the most elegant and the most handsome young man about town." "Do you mean," said Mrs Somerive, "the son of his elder brother, Lord Taymouth?" "Oh, not at all; he is a miserable looking mortal. No, this nephew, as Eliza tells me, is the only son of his sister, Lady something Tracy, who married a Mr Warwick, who, though a gentleman, her family thought was a match so much beneath her that they never forgave her; and as she and her husband both died early, this young man, who was their only child, and had a very small fortune, was brought up by the General, who means to make him his heir." "He is a good creature," said Mrs Somerive, "and everything I hear increases my esteem for him." "You would consent then, my dear mamma," replied Isabella, "to my having Captain Warwick?" "Alas!" answered her mother mournfully, "Captain Warwick, my dear girls, heir to the fortune of General Tracy, will never, I fear, ask my consent. Young women, without fortune, though their merit be indisputable, are not likely to marry at all, very unlikely, indeed, to meet with such high fortune." "I don't see that at all," cried Isabella. "Selina and Emma may determine to die old maids if they please; but, for my part, I'll try, as long as I am young and good looking, for a husband. And as to this Warwick, I am bent upon setting my cap at him without mercy. If his uncle would but give me an opportunity, that he will not do; for though he is so good to him, and gives him such an handsome allowance, he hardly ever sees him, and has brought him a company in another regiment, rather than have him his own, and so he is sent off to America, and—" "You have no chance then," interrupted Mrs Somerive, "of trying your power, Isabella." "No," cried she, "but it is excellent sport to tease his uncle about him, who always avoids talking of him, just like a perquisite mamma, who hates to hear that Miss is tall and handsome." Mrs Somerive, again gently reproving her daughter for speaking thus of the General, put an end to the conversation by sending her daughter away to dress for dinner. While she meditated alone on what her husband had that morning said to her on the subject of Orlando's entering the army, he had now, for the first time, explained to her all the reasons he had for wishing his son to be removed from Rayland Hall, and had communicated the principles of these, his suspicions of an attachment to Monimia. Mrs Somerive felt all the truth of what her husband urged in favour of this plan, and, particularly uneasy at the information he had given her about Monimia, she now tried to reason herself out of those fears of his personal safety, which yet led her to wish he might remain, on whatever terms, near her and his family. End of Volume 2, Chapter 3. Recording by Elaine Webb, Bristol, England.